Welcome to The Wire. I'm Sharat Pradhan, and today I bring to you a very interesting study which tells us why the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party is averse to the idea of a caste census that political parties like the Rashtriya Janata Dal of Lalu Prasad Yadav and Samajwadi Party led by Akhilesh Yadav have been demanding very vociferously. Well, their idea is to let the people know what is the numerical strength of the backwards. But the ruling party is against the idea because that will expose how the OBCs continue to remain a deprived class despite the common impression that they have taken over the governance and of the country ever since the advent of the Mandal Commission. And the 1989 was the turning point when the Mandal Commission recommendations were accepted by the then Vishwanath Pratap Singh government, following which became the rise of the OBCs, that is other backward classes. And thereafter, the parties that came up, largely caste-based parties, they got their space in governance. But did they actually get their space? Is what we are going to discuss. And I bring to you Professor Giles Verniers, a Belgian who made India his home for almost 2 decades. He did his education, early education, that is at class 12, under an exchange program from Gujarat, out of all places. And thereafter, he kept shuttling between Belgium, France, and India, and eventually he taught here at the famous Ashoka University for a good 9 years. And he's done very interesting studies. Currently, he's working on some books. And this study tells us what is the status of the backward castes in India, and more particularly states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, where their politics is supposedly been dominating over the past 3 decades. Welcome, Giles. Welcome to the show. Well, I was wanting to know what inspired you and what led you to carry out a study on these lines, to study the backward status in India.
Well, I started my doctoral work back in 2007 during the UP election. And this, as you remember, was a landmark election, which was won, for the first time with a single majority by Mayawati ji, and it was the first majority, victory in many years in UP. And when I started my work, I started, interviewing office bearers and candidates and within parties. And I was struck by the discourse that the BSP was holding on inclusion. The claim that they were no longer to be associated as, strictly speaking, a Dalit party, but that they were providing representation across, an array of groups, and that they would bring or usher a kind of social transformation that would sort of erase caste differences, create a society that was more equal. And given the fact that there was always been a deep association between caste, which is an unequal hierarchical institution, and politics and democracy in India, it was some sort of a new discourse that was interesting. But then when I started doing fieldwork, I started to realize that the people who were sort of carrying that social revolution on the ground, the candidates, did not exactly have profile that sort of matched those ideas, right? In the course of few weeks and months where I, covered, the election, I found, candidates who were drawn from locally dominant groups or local strongmen or criminals, people who had actually very little experience, but who were paying extravagant already then, amount of money to get into politics. And I thought it's a bit strange that on the one hand, you have this claim that we become socially inclusive, we cater for the poor, and at the same time, the actors or the agents of that transformation seem to be rather elite. And so I got interested to sort of study
in
this.
one form or the other, elite in the form of actual elite, and in the form of muscle power and money power.
Exactly.
Was different.
Exactly. And so, and it occurred to me, and we know that from, the work done by other political scientists, and that Indian politics has always been, sort of elitist. The whole Congress system was based on a system of cooptation of local strongmen and local elites, traditional elites, mostly upper caste, landed, and who basically did the job of mobilizing and controlling territories on behalf of the party. And that system excluded large segment of the population, mostly among the backwards. And that basically explains sort of the churning that takes place in the late 60s and 70s, the rise of Kisan politics, which transforms later on into caste politics. And so through the period, and even still in 2007, right, the theme was, the rise of the plebeians, the rise of the backwards, an apparent shift of power, or shift of the balance of power between traditional elites, mostly upper caste, and ascending members of the backwards. And the BSP, in a way, brought that up to the fore in 2007. The SP imitated that model in the 2012 elections, and the BJP actually followed suit by also claiming to be, no longer the Banya upper caste, Brahmin Banya party of yore, and become this sort of social rainbow inclusive platform. And so I got interested to see, what is the evidence? What can we, and what does the evidence, tell us about that? And so I started gathering information about, who contests, who runs for office. And I did find that over the period from, the early 2000s onwards, you do see a greater diversity of actors running for elections. You see political parties being more willing to provide representations to groups they were not associated with previously, non-Yadav OBCs and upper caste within the Samajwadi party, upper caste and other OBCs and non-Jatav Dalits, among the BSP, lower OBCs among the BJP, and so forth. So you do see that.
You mean to say, Giles, that earlier, prior to this, even after the coming in of the Mandal Commission, the political power was concentrated among a few backward castes, which were dominant already and who already enjoyed a lot of muscle and money power.
So that was the perception, and it was, partly verified by, by evidence that, the growth of the Samajwadi party basically came along the phenomenon of empowerment of dominant group among the backwards, right? In Western UP, you have sort of, the prevalence of Jat domination, you have the Yadav domination. Even within the BSP has always been a party dominated by Jatavs. And so what you didn't have, the rise of backwards was in a way unequal because not everyone was getting, raised. Some groups were benefiting more. And the BJP very intelligently banked on that and developed a discourse of inclusion that sort of say, we represent everyone who's not represented by these two other parties. So all the non-Yadav OBCs, all the non-Jatav Dalits, all are welcome, and all, should, find a place and will find a place within the BJP. That was the 60-40 strategy put in place during the 2017 election. And so if you look in terms of representational outcomes, you see that there is a greater diversity on the basis of caste within political parties, within the BJP, but also before that within the SP and within the BSP. But the question that I ask is that, does this diversification amount to empowerment for the groups that are thus, represented? And does it amount to a shift in the balance of power between traditional elites or the new elites of the 90s and those emerging groups within those parties? And so if you look,
and what did you find? Did you find that they were getting their legitimate share in terms of the numerical strength that they enjoy?
We can debate what legitimate share means, right? But if I look today at OBC representation within the BJP, it is true that you have more OBCs within the party, which also has many more seats than before, And so there is a number effect that is there. I think today roughly 30% of BJP's MLAs are OBCs. But when you look at who they are, because OBCs do not represent a homogeneous category, right? But if you look at Jati, if you look at divisions among the backwards, you find that a large number of groups are represented by only a handful of representatives, right? 1, 2, etc. And so OBCs within parties do not represent a caucus. They don't represent a cohesive ensemble, right? All those groups are also competing against one another within party structure to get tickets, and so forth. And so you have a representation that is there, but it's still very fragmented. And it reflects the state of fragmentation of OBCs, right? On the other hand, the representation of upper caste has hardly diminished over time, right? Upper caste still represent between 40-45% of all BJP MLAs. And so this effort of inclusion has not necessarily led to a dilution of the power or share of representation that upper caste have within parties. And again, this is not a phenomenon that is limited to the BJP. You still have a strong upper caste and we have representation within the SP. You still have a high representation of dominant group, within the BSP. That is when they had MLAs. Right now, of course, it's a different situation. Right, and so that's one aspect, right? Whether the rise.
What about the Congress? Congress was initially a party of elitists, and it was a Brahmin-dominated party for a long time. And of course, no matter how much it might have come down in terms of its political strength, but still Congress remains the second most important political party. And what is their
well, in India, yes, but not in UP. In UP, they have become a 2% party, right? But through its history, it is true that the Congress has remained a largely upper caste-based party. There was this bias that was, really, really strong, from independence onwards. And then the story of the decline of Congress is also the story of its inability to attract vote and to provide representation to groups other than upper caste and SCs in reserved seats. And so in many ways, in terms of electoral support, the Congress lost largely upper caste support to the benefit of other parties, today the BJP, but other regional parties in the past. Muslims have also deserted largely the Congress parties. Dalit also left the party. And so the problem in a way of the Congress is that it claims to be this all-encompassing umbrella, nationalist party, but as a result of its decline, it has become a party of nobody in particular. Right?
But since it coincided, the fall of the Congress, decline of the Congress, coincided with the rise of the OBCs.
That's right. But the share of representation of upper caste in the UP Assembly has actually diminished over time. They used to be 50, 55, sometimes more % of the MLAs, and they gradually came down around 40 around Mandal, and then around 30 after Mandal. But they always remain overrepresented. There was always a larger share of upper caste than OBCs. And the reason is that all parties actually cannot afford to distribute tickets without taking care of groups that remain part of the elite, even if they have lost somewhat their monopoly, the kind of monopoly that they had in the past. And so if you look at the period of growth, the initial growth of regional parties, both BSP and SP, was a consolidation of their support among OBCs and particular segments of OBCs, dominant segments. But the second phase of expansion in the 2000s, when they came to power with majorities on their own, that was also the result of a broadening of their scope of representation by the inclusion of upper caste, by the inclusion of groups that they were not particularly representing before. And again, the BJP learned the lesson from that and also adopted this, card of inclusion, which in fact they had played before. 2017 was not the first time where we saw a consolidation of lower OBC votes for the BJP. We had seen that actually in the early 2000s. We had seen that, in earlier BJP government more than 20 years ago. And so, but again, the question is, does that amount to a shift in the balance of power? So one
exactly that is what I wanted to know. When does it, even though they started giving more share to the OBC castes, did the OBCs actually benefit out of that in terms of getting the desired share which they had expected or which was portrayed? Did they actually get it on ground?
Well, that's a difficult question, right? Because what we know from socioeconomic data that's available from a variety of surveys is that the economic growth, the socioeconomic growth of lower backward groups has not really matched their increase of representation. So the idea that increasing representation of certain groups will necessarily lead to a general empowerment or lifting up of the members of those groups, that's not something that happens, obviously, automatically. When you look at who runs for office, who are the candidates, you see that they belong to a greater diversity of caste background compared to the past. That is true. But if you look at other variables, and particularly declared assets or their occupational profile, you see that they all tend to be very wealthy individuals from their communities. Even among the lower groups, the Nishas and the Rajbat, etc., the candidates that are selected by parties tend to be crore-patis, right? That has to do with competitive pressure, the cost of entry into politics, the necessity to rely on self-funded candidates, the centrality of money in electoral politics, and so forth. And so,
and have they been one small question, Gil? These people who have acquired wealth, is it correct that they acquired wealth after entering politics, or they were already wealthy and that's the reason they got a space in different political parties?
See, the cost of entry is very high. So if you're not independently wealthy before joining politics, it's very hard to get a ticket in the first place. Right? There is a system of what I call informal primary system within parties, selection of candidates, which is very informal, which is actually enormously costly, which is also can be also quite brutal. I mean, you know more about ground realities, than I do about that.
There's so much talk about tickets being sold by certain political parties. And if there's kind of
that too. The BSP was notorious in the past for auctioning tickets and so forth. And so there is a process of selection by money. But we know also that the rate of enrichment of elected representative in UP and everywhere else almost in India is actually considerable. I look at affidavit data and at self-declared asset data of candidates, and they tend to be twice as rich as in the previous election over the past 3-4 elections. So the growth rate of individual wealth is absolutely phenomenal. And so that's one aspect. The other aspect is that in the past, most candidates came from either agriculture, they were farmers, they were landowner, or they were some, liberal profession. They were lawyers. They used to be 20-25% of lawyers, in the assembly in the past, and a lot of people were, at least self-declared farmers. Very few people declared business as their occupation. And what we've seen over the past 20 years is a considerable rise of candidates who emerge from local business network, right? Who come from sectors like construction, like real estate, who come from transport companies, distribution companies, sectors of liquor distribution and so forth. I mean, all your usual suspects. And
even education now. Now education has become as they say,
absolutely.
A lot of educational institutions, particularly technical education, medical colleges, engineering colleges, are actually owned by a whole lot of politicians.
Yeah, coaching centers also. And it's a great way to combine business and the claim that you're giving back to society, right? By helping create education opportunities, which
Putting
of
up a
course is
facade. That's more of a facade than actual.
well. A lot of them are money shops, and I mean we know that these are immensely profitable businesses also. But so the picture that comes out is that you have a political class that on one hand is more diverse on the basis of caste, but at the same time becomes more and more homogeneous in terms of class, in terms of economic background, right? And therefore the question, who is representing whom exactly comes into the picture. Then there is a third layer to this, which is the fact that most politicians in UP do not have long careers. The majority actually of MLAs disappear after their first election, right?
Is it because they fail to live up to the expectations of the electorate, or is it on account of other reasons?
So there's a number of reasons. There's a party-induced effect. Parties tend to deny tickets to incumbent MLAs to a fairly large extent. Mayawati was notorious for that. Keep changing her candidates, but other parties as well. And then among those who rerun, roughly half of them actually don't make it. Right? And so there is part of it is party induced, part of it is voter induced. There is, I mean, it's a longer conversation, but a lot of MLAs would tell you, with anguish, the feeling of limitation that they have, right? The needs of their constituents are there, and their capacity to deliver is actually there. And it's just impossible to meet, everybody's needs. And since the main job of MLAs is to provide access to, public resources or whatever resource they can access to, they are bound to disappoint because they cannot satisfy.
And this must be more the case with the opposition MLAs, because they have lesser access to the benefits of power.
There is that too. But in my experience, people can be professional politicians, whether they win or lose, whether they are elected or not. Sometimes the most powerful politicians are not, the MLAs, but there are people who, because of their history, persona, exert dominance locally. They don't even have to run for elections, but they perform the job of an elected representative nonetheless. So you have that too. But the reality is that most politicians have very short careers. And so on the one hand, you have a high cost of entry. It's getting into politics. It's a very risky, costly investment. On the other hand, you have a high probability of early exit. And so this creates systemically incentives for predatory behavior, right? It gives incentives to make the most of their position in the short run, and before they actually disappear. And so whether this
you mean to say that sorry to interrupt you, you mean to say that because of this reason, because of the high cost of entry, they have to replenish themselves of whatever they have spent to gain an entry, and all their concentration is on acquiring more and more wealth so that they can continue there and at least recover what they have spent? Is that the reason?
Yes. I mean, the moment you get elected, you have to start raising money from day one to prepare your re-election. If you intend to be re-elected, if you ambition to be re-elected in the first place, but you also have to raise money to recoup your investment, right? Many crores spent to get the tickets, to campaign, and political entry in India is peculiar because we know the candidates sort of at the last moment. Tickets are distributed very late in the process. But people spend years to prepare themselves to become a candidate, right? You have to act, you have to behave like a politician, you have to spend like a politician before you get even a chance of getting a ticket, because that's how you get, a party's attention. Oh, this is an effective candidate. He has the resources, he has the incentives, he has the muscles, he belongs to the right, this is the right, caste identity within that particular constituency, and so forth. And so people spend years.
This is quite unlike the West. Is it quite unlike the West?
Yeah, I mean, in Europe at least, candidates hardly spend money. It's highly regulated. They have very little resources to spend on their own campaign. Actually, political parties spend money on campaigns, and these are usually publicly funded. It's also strictly regulated. The amount of money spent by individual candidates in British elections is ridiculous compared to, few £1,000s. I mean, this is not what party spends in advertising and so forth, right? But the individual cost for candidates is not that high. But in India, it's absolutely gigantic. I mean, we know that Indian elections are more costly than American elections. For instance.
And even this new system that has been evolved of getting bonds, issuing bonds, has been circumvented. So they say.
Yeah, I mean that
public funding has become more of a facade than actually being happening on ground.
But that's not public funding, because the purpose of public funding is to create transparency and accountability, and the electoral bond achieve precisely the contrary.
Okay.
And in any case, the money does not. And in any case, the money does not come from the public; it comes from private hands.
Right. Very true. So, and in this process, this will make it even more difficult for the deprived castes, for the weaker among the deprived castes, I should say, to actually get into the electoral system.
No, of course, and I'm not saying that there are no benefits. Obviously, when members of small lower castes or backward castes see that they have representative in the cabinet, it has a symbolic impact. And but the question is, does it translate into actual
share in governance?
Power? Exactly. Yeah. So if you look at the cabinet. Yeah, exactly. So if you look at the cabinet, for example, there's a good number of OBC ministers, and that's actually been increased in 2022 compared to 2017. But they tend to be concentrated into lower ministerial positions, while the members of the cabinet tend to be more upper caste still. So you still have the maintenance of these hierarchies. And one sign that everything is not that rosy within a party like the BJP is that usually some people that they bring in, those lower OBC leaders usually leave the party because they find that they did not get exactly what they were expecting, or they were not treated the way they were expecting to be treated. And we've seen these small Rajbar parties, etc., so sort of breaking alliances with the BJP ahead of the last 2022 election. And so this basically reveals that there is intense competition for power within political parties as well.
Right. And the as you said, you mean to say that in numbers there may be enough numbers of ministerial berths being given to OBCs, but the kind of portfolios that are given are invariably insignificant. So and that is the reason why they don't seem to be satisfied with what they are getting, and they walk away.
Yeah, I would not say insignificant, right? Because even these, less significant. And what I'm saying is that there is still a maintenance of a hierarchy principle, even if it's diluted compared to the past. But even BSP cabinet in 2007 had a huge presence of upper caste ministers, right? There were in fact very few Dalits in the Mayawati government, right? Because she had to create space for these elite candidates, elite politicians that she was wooing, right? And that also contributed to a lot of dissatisfaction among Dalits with the party, because they saw that, hey, but all these people are basically, reaping the benefits, but what about us? And so this is all very dynamic, right? The idea is to show that there is intense competition happening. If you only look at the facade of caste diversity, it gives you a certain picture of inclusion. But if you look at the balance of power that lies sort of behind, you see that things are a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated.
Okay, okay. And so, do you have any? Can you give us some data if you have done a study on that as to how many of these OBCs actually got ministerial berths, yet they were not significant enough to keep them satisfied?
Yes. So in the cabinet, you currently have 15 OBC ministers, or 18 if you include Jats, among them. You have 24 upper caste ministers, 8 SC ministers. So if you club SCs and OBCs, it comes to a fairly similar number of ministers. But upper caste represent a majority of. There are twice as many upper caste ministers in the cabinet compared to OBCs, 11 against 5. Right, and that is including, of course, the chief minister himself. And so you cannot say that there is a strict hierarchy and that OBCs are completely, limited to, subaltern positions. There is representation, but there is also the maintenance of certain old hierarchies. Another area that one can look at is, the area of policy, right? And the fact is that for all the claims of providing more representations to backward classes, successive BJP governments have, or the recent BJP governments have sort of reduced the scale of benefits that backwards were getting through affirmative action, and through a variety of other policies, by creating a 10% quota for poor members of forward classes, and so forth. And so a few OBC leaders outside and also within the OBCs have also decried the fact that in terms of policy, we're not, where are the policies that benefit us and that they actually are expecting. And this is where regional parties have a card to play, because they can say that, okay, the BJP provides representation to a few elite OBCs, but we actually plan to expand on, state benefits to these groups by expanding the scope of reservation, by going beyond the 50%, by holding a caste census to actually figure out what the numbers actually are. And this is something you said in your introduction, is something that the BJP is deeply opposed to.
And it's naturally, because then the whole thing will get exposed. The cat will come out of the bag.
Maybe, but it's also because it would be a Pandora box, right? Whose consequences would be very difficult to control. Whenever there has been a huge debate or big policy shift in terms of affirmative action or reservation in India, it's created a lot of political churning. And the parties that initiated those policies usually were wiped out in the process, right?
Yeah.
I mean, VP Singh perhaps was one of the most consequential prime minister, in recent decades, precisely because of that decision. He he did not, reap, a benefit from it, and the Congress Party, of course.
In fact, he lost. He lost after that. Lost after that.
Exactly. There are other recent examples in Karnataka where the Congress government ordered for an equivalent of a caste survey to be done, and then when they saw the numbers, they got scared that this is going to create so much unrest that we cannot responsibly release that data, and the data in fact was never really released, right? And so I think there is a fear also of engaging into political acts that have consequences that cannot be controlled.
Right. So that's sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that, and beyond the fact that objectively upper caste don't have an interest in an exercise that could basically reveal that the demographic weight of backwards is actually may actually be larger than what we know.
That's very true, and so that remains the biggest problem with any ruling dispensation, for that matter. This would come up anytime such an exercise is initiated, and that's the reason one should not expect that there would ever be a caste-based census in this country.
Well, we never know, right? I mean, Bihar is on the way of conducting its own. They don't call it census because they can't call it census. They call it survey or census scale survey. So Bihar, in all probability, will do it, and if alternative majorities emerge through state elections, it's possible that other government follow suit. It's more likely to happen at the state level than at the national level. I mean, remember that the Congress conducted the caste census during the 2011 exercise, and they never released the data.
That's right. That's right. Is that data still classified?
As far as I know, it is, yes.
So it makes it very obvious that the political class has always been dominated. The political class happens to be coming largely from the upper caste in India, in most states. Yeah. But is this prevalence higher in North India, or do you see, since you have done a study across the country also?
There has been,
pattern seen in southern states also.
Yeah, the rise of backwards has been essentially a North Indian story or a Hindi belt story, right? Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, UP, even Chhattisgarh and so forth. In southern states like Andhra Pradesh or Maharashtra or Karnataka, you see much more consistency in the overrepresentation of dominant groups. Right? In 60 years of electoral politics, the share of representation of Lingats and Vocaligas in Karnataka has not diminished, right? The share of Maratha representation in Maharashtra politics has not diminished. In Andhra Pradesh, the share of representation of Reddis actually increased through time. In Bengal, during the communist period, upper caste representation actually increased over time, kept increasing over time.
Okay.
Now it's somewhat changed under the Trinamool, right? And so you have much more persistence of these, patterns of, caste-based dominance that has to do with land ownership, that has to do with, the controlling presence that members of these groups have over constituencies, over territories. They have been very difficult to dislodge. And it comes from the fact that no party can afford to not cater to the interest of these groups, right? And for all the talks about the connections between the Lingayats and the BJP, the Congress cannot afford to undermine and to not provide representation, which means that regardless of which party wins or loses the election, those castes never lose. Right?
And if this began in the southern states, how is it that the northern parts of the country, the political parties did not realize this earlier? As you said, that in the southern states, probably this realization dawned on them much earlier, and that is the reason they started giving the political parties, the ruling class castes, they started giving more share to the deprived ones.
Yeah, I mean, each state has, its own trajectory. I mean, Tamil Nadu, of course, has a much longer history, of a backward movement. We got rid of, the power and influence of, Tamil Brahmins, very, very long time ago, actually way ahead of almost, everyone else, right? So each state has, their own trajectory. But the trajectory across North India, and particularly in UP, has been, this constant principle of local elite cooptation, right? And co-opting the local elites meant privileging traditional elites, which were mostly landed upper caste, right? And the story of, the transformation, social, political, economical transformation of the state has been, the contestation of the legitimacy of the hold on power that these groups had, right? But it took a very long time. Right. If you look at the Kisan movement, for example, or the socialist movement in UP, it was dominated by upper caste, even if they tried to mobilize other segments. Right. Charan Singh was the one exception, but
most started it.
Exactly.
Right.
And so you really need to wait for the late 80s and the early 90s to see, that kind of, churning taking place. Now we are in a different phase. No party can afford not to claim to be inclusive. And no party can afford not making efforts to appear to be more diverse and more inclusive. And parties have done such efforts. My contention is that this has not
Inclusive in
necessarily...
terms of only caste, not religion.
Exactly. Well, that too, but because after a period of growth of representation, Muslims have more or less disappeared from the assembly in UP. But my contention is that the definition of elites has changed through time. Parties that claim to represent the backward castes became themselves elites, right? The new elites, the young elites, and that actually the BJP to build this anti-establishment discourse, right? Everyone who's not a Yadav or Jatav or a Muslim, can come with us, and we'll provide you representation, right? And so backward parties themselves became very strongly elitist, right? For a variety of reasons. Some in their command, other because of constraints of the electoral system and the realities of electoral competition. And you do have a prevalence of elitism in political recruitment. Not so much on the basis of caste as in the past, but certainly on the basis of money.
Yeah, very, very true. That's very well said. But as far as the dominance and the fading out of Muslims is concerned from the political scene, is it largely because of the politics of majoritarianism that is being played up by the BJP and the politics of hatred?
And sorry, could you repeat your question?
No, I'm saying that the fading away of Muslims from the political mainstream, is it attributable to the politics of majoritarianism, that is Hindutva politics, played up by the BJP, as well as the politics of hatred?
The political
is it
project,
because of that?
The political project pursued by the BJP and organization it's affiliated to is to exercise a control of the public, to put the public sphere in the hands of the majority community. Muslims can coexist, they can remain on the territory, they can be beneficiary of social welfare policies, right? But they may not have a say, or they may not have representation in the public sphere. And so you see that by the exclusion of Muslims from candidates lists. Of course, the BJP is, a savvy party, and so they try to create sort of, exceptions. They've fielded a number of Muslims in recent municipal elections, for example, in UP. But these are essentially in areas where you have actually a large, Muslim population that does not have the vocation of translating into more candidates where there's actually power. We know that municipalities don't have, that much power, so the BJP can afford giving, some tickets, to Muslims there. But where it matters, they must be excluded, right? And in a way, not providing representation to Muslims is a way to demonstrate their agenda without having to say anything, right? Because the message is crystal clear. Who gets to be represented? Who gets to be included? Who gets to have political representation?
But at the same time, they've been trying trying to forge division among Muslims by raising this question of Pasmanda Muslims, which is the downtrodden among the Muslims. We've been classified under this nomenclature of Pasmanda.
Absolutely. So their attempts to reach out at Muslims, it's always reaching out at a particular segment, right? It used to be the Shias, now it's Pasmanda because it also fits with, the class discourse that they affect. The goal very clearly is to divide, right?
Very true.
And in a way, Muslims in UP are already, hopelessly fragmented and divided, right? In class, in caste, in sectarian divisions. They do not represent a homogeneous group at all. And so maintaining or playing on these divisions, it's something that actually is useful to, in the larger picture, prevent a rise of Muslims in
Very
power.
well. So ultimately, Gilles, it is the divide and rule policy which we often condemn and attribute it to the British who ruled India, and we continue to follow that same policy in order to retain power, which is the. Don't you think that is the saddest part?
That's your first statement.
Well, thank you so much for being with us on the wire and for providing us so much insight into this whole issue of why the BJP is shirking away from any kind of census on caste lines, because that will expose the actual devolution of power that has gone to those deprived classes, which came up only as a consequence of the Mandal Commission. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.